For the rest of this video, you will not notice my Transylvanian accent, nor will you notice the fact I am not wearing traditional vampire costume as I intended. Because the one that arrived this morning from Amazon was so small it cut off the circulation to my kloogie. And finally, for the remainder of this video, my eyes will appear blue and normal because these wannabe Brad Pitt contact lenses are burning the shit out of my eyes.
Let the Right One In is a 2008 Swedish horror film directed by Thomas Alfredson. It is set in 1980s Stockholm, Sweden, and it is based on John Lindqvist's novel of the same name. The movie stars Lena Leandersson, Kari Hedebrant, Per Ragnar, and Peter Karlberg. Let the Right One In was so well received, Matt Reeves ripped it off in 2010, and Showcase turned it into a series in 2022. I will be reviewing the series separately. However, in my humble opinion, Matt Reeves is a rip-off artist, and reviewing his impersonation of the original movie feels like a waste of time for you and me.
How about it, folks? Welcome to the channel. Today's movie has me very excited. It was suggested by one of our subscribers, 80s Altar Boy. Let the Right One In is a deep, multi-layered movie, and I think unraveling a few of these layers might help some people to understand this is not just another vampire movie. Let's get right into it.
The movie opens with this shot of snow at night, and they've bookended the film by closing with the exact same shot. In movie language, snow is used to represent anything from isolation and loneliness to harshness and adversity. And as this opening shot cuts directly to our main character, 12-year-old Oscar, director Thomas Alfredson's using snow to represent purity and innocence in this first instance. We meet Oscar, played by Kari Hedebrant, and he's alone in his apartment fantasizing about getting revenge on his school bullies. And while he's doing that, a man and a young girl move into the apartment next door. The next day in school, we find out Oscar actually enjoys reading, and his behavior is what's attracted the attention of the school bullies. Meanwhile, Haken, the new next-door neighbor, played by Per Ragnar, who you'd only really recognize if you were into Swedish drama films, prepares a kit to extract blood from a man he kills in the park. And right in the middle of draining the man, the smell attracts a dog, and Haken's forced to run off, leaving the dog's owner to make the grisly discovery. Back outside his apartment, young Oscar's practicing the do unto others what has been done to you credo, responsible for turning countless abuse victims into abusers themselves. As he stabs a tree, he repeats the exact words the bullies used on him earlier that day. And while he's gaining a sense of control over the tree, the young girl from next door appears behind him. And in defiance of the movie's modest budget, we're treated to the first of many flawless special effects when she drops to the ground as if she's got no respect for gravity. She tells Oscar they're not going to end up friends just because she moved in next door, and then she leaves as quickly as she arrived. Inside their apartment, the young girl screams at the man for failing to bring blood back, and they tweak her voice just enough to let us know this is no child.
Say nothing, though!
The man apologizes, but it's obvious this argument's played out many times before. The next day in school, the teacher counsels the kids about the dead man in the park. When Oscar gets home, his mother's furious he's been roaming around outside while a murderer's on the loose. When his mother's lecture's done, he snags her newspaper and cuts out an article about the murder and adds it to his scrapbook filled with all sorts of similar subject matter. These two things are subtle, but ultimately integral to the story as it progresses. Oscar's naturally interested in morbid things despite having loving parents and a safe living environment. Then we cut to a few of the locals at the Sun Palace Cafe, and most of them live in Oscar's building, so they recognize the new man as having just moved in. They invite him to sit down with them, but he takes off immediately. And back at the apartment, Oscar ditches his mother halfway through a television series they're watching together. His mother asks why he's leaving her. He says he doesn't like the program. So she reminds him to stay right outside in the yard for his own safety.
This further emphasizes a point we touched on a few minutes ago. His mother's a single mother, but she's a loving mother that enjoys spending time with her son. So as far as single mothers go, she's perfect. She's even friggin' knitting during the scene.
Ely meets Oscar outside again, and this time he's got a Rubik's Cube. The fact that he's useless at it breaks my heart, probably because I couldn't get a single side at his age either.
And this is another area this movie has Hollywood dead to rights. Oscar isn't traditionally good-looking. Nobody in this movie is traditionally good-looking. If anything, he's kind of pathetic. He wasn't cast in this role for his jawline or his number of social media followers.
Kari Hadebrant walked in for an open audition with 4,000 other children, and they gave it to him immediately because he came across timid and a bit complicated in real life. After telling Ely she smells funny, he gives her his Rubik's Cube, and she takes it and seems genuinely fascinated by it until the hunger takes her over. We see another example of perfect, low-budget visual effects when a 12-year-old girl's transformed into an old woman with giant golem eyes in a tight, well-lit shot that I can't find any flaws in no matter how many times I rewind it. The hunger proves too much for Ely, and she's forced to lure a good Samaritan under a bridge by pretending she's a hurt child. The man picks her up, and the instant she gets a whiff of his throat, it is over. And the noises that come out of her would make you shit your pants if you heard them under a bridge yourself. After she feeds, we're treated to another brilliant simple shot when she breaks the man's neck to put him out of his misery. She's on the back of a real man who has his head buried underground, and Ely twists a fake head and the real man's body spasms in response, and it looks fantastic. Then, consumed by the guilt of having to kill somebody, she cries. This differentiates her from every single Hollywood vampire since Count Orlok.
I've said this in the past. My issue with a lot of modern vampire movies is the glamorization. Let the Right One In portrays vampirism in line with its real-life folklore, which is linked directly to victims of the plague outbreaks in the Middle Ages. Vampires are meant to be vile, filthy, cursed human beings, and this movie treats them that way, and I love it.
Unfortunately for Ailey, one of the neighbors saw what happened, and he tells everyone in the cafe. They find blood buried under the snow, but the body's gone because Hakens disposed of it in a panic, in the fastest, laziest possible way. Back in the yard, Ely's returned Oscar's Rubik's Cube as promised, only she solved it. That fascinates Oscar, and me, if I'm honest. The pair finally exchange names, and when Ely asks if she smells better, Oscar politely turns his head and says nothing. When Ely says she's roughly 12 years old, Oscar probes her on the roughly part. And then things get awkward because she doesn't know her own birthday and she has no idea about the concept of birthday presents. So Oscar breaks the silence by prompting her to show him how she solved the cube, and she's more than happy with him changing the subject so abruptly. And while she's showing him, he sits quietly observing her, looking at her hair, watching her hands. He's accepting her in all her weirdness, knowing he's a bit weird himself. It's a beautifully understated scene full of subtlety and nuance, and it should have been left that way by filmmakers who don't understand these sorts of qualities. The next day, Oscar stays after class to teach himself Morse code because texting wasn't a thing in the 80s. When he's finished, the bullies are waiting for him, and if you were bullied at any point in your youth, this scene hits pretty hard. The kids whip him with sticks, and while they're doing it, Oscar closes his eyes and retreats into himself. The final assault slices his cheek wide open, and he internalizes it without responding. That night after dinner, he teaches Ely the Morse code so they can talk through the walls, because he's under the impression all the screaming next door is Ely's dad shouting at her. But Ely cuts straight to the point, referencing his cheek, and she tells him he has to hit back when the kids bully him, and she offers to help him if he can't do it himself. They both head back to their respective apartments, and the Morse code starts. And after that, Oscar signs up for weightlifting at school, and then he takes Ely to a sweet shop and finds out the hard way she can't eat normal food, so he hugs her. And while he's hugging her, she asks him if he'd still like her if she wasn't a girl, and he says yes.
In the novel, they openly present Ely as a 200-year-old castrated boy. It's explicitly explored, and that gives readers insight into the character's true nature and gender confusion. The movie hints at these aspects with a few quick cutaways and dialogue, but the director felt just hinting at it would suit the movie's limited runtime better.
We briefly meet Oscar's father during one of his visits, and then back at Ely's we get a sense of the dynamic between her and her familiar when he asks her not to see Oscar later that night. This tells us he's been with her a very long time, given this hint at an apparent romantic connection.
Haken's character is far more sympathetic in the movie. In the book, he's a straight-up pedo, and we're just gonna leave that right there.
Ely rubs his face, and that tells us she's got no intention of honoring his request. So that night, when he's caught stringing up one of the local kids, he decides a familiar's life is too thankless and he douses himself in acid before the police can ID him. Back at the school after his gym session, Oscar finds his pants have been stuck into the urinals, so he has to walk home in the Swedish winter without any on. When Ely finds out what happened on the radio, she heads to the hospital to visit. When the receptionist tells her he can't have visitors, she leaves. When the concerned receptionist goes out to look for her, thinking she's a child, she misses her. Which you might too if you're not paying attention, as she Spider-Man'd her way all the way up the wall to sneak in Haken's 7th floor window. Another subtle, believable special effect. But there's nothing subtle about the next scene. He pulls out his breathing tube and offers himself to her. The damage from the acid is brilliant. When she's finished, she lets him fall to his death 7 stories down, and even the fall and the sounds are realistic. Ely heads straight back to Oscar's, and she tells him he has to invite her in, so he does. And she climbs into bed next to him. He asks if he has a chance with her, and she reminds him she's not a girl. So he repeats the question, and Ely agrees. And Oscar's little heart soars as she runs her fingertip up and down his arm. And I would call it lovely if it wasn't so technically illegal. The next morning, the class goes skating for a school trip, and as per usual, Oscar keeps to himself on the fringe. Of course, the bullies recognize his isolation, and they move in, threatening to force him into the frozen water. But this time, Oscar's got love in his heart. That makes him strong. And happy, apparently. The body of the man Ely killed under the bridge is discovered and cut out of the frozen lake, with Haken the dead familiar the likely suspect. With Oscar's newfound confidence, he brings Ely to his secret place in the bowels of the apartment building. And once they're settled with some nice music playing, Oscar cuts his hand and offers it to her so they can be blood brothers of sorts. But the smell drives Ely feral, and she laps up all the spilled blood. When she screams a warning at Oscar to get out, we catch a glimpse of Ely's true face, and there's nothing cute about it. Oscar freezes on the spot, so Ely leaves instead. But the taste of blood sent her into a frenzy, so she climbs the closest tree and pounces on the first passerby. And the first passerby happens to be the local lady from the cafe, Virginia. But her boyfriend Lackey saves her before Ely can finish her off, and that's not as good a thing as it sounds. The next morning, she's woken up by the sun singeing her fingers. And we all know what that means. As the day goes on, things get worse for her, and after trying to dig up any frozen blood left under the snow, she ends up in the hospital.
In the book, Virginia and her boyfriend Lackey's stories are fully fleshed out and explained in proper detail. But in the movie, they focus exclusively on her transforming into a vampire and what ultimately happens to her later on.
Back at Oscar's father's house, the visit's cut short when his father's friend swings round unannounced. So Oscar splits and hitchhikes home, because at this point in the story, he's got other things on his mind. He goes straight to Ely, and they have the talk. Ely tells him she lives off of blood and that she's been 12 years old for a very long time. Then she shows him a table full of valuable items she's accumulated over the years. She offers Oscar a fistful of money, but he's suddenly cold with her and wants to go home. Back in the hospital, Virginia's restrained and having a really shitty time. She suggests to her partner Lackey that Ely must have infected her with something, and she begs him to do her in. And of course, he declines. So the following morning, when the doctor comes in, she asks him to open the blinds, knowing full well what'll happen to her. And it does happen to her, and it is shockingly well done as a visual effect. After the poor ending to their last meeting, Ely swings by Oscar's to patch things up, and when she reminds him she needs an invite inside, Oscar decides to force her to come in without an invite, as he's annoyed with her. And we're treated to yet another brilliant scene in which the 12-year-old actress goes ghost white and bleeds from her pores and her ears and her mouth and her eyes and her back. The shock of what he's done to her sends Oscar into a panic as he quickly invites her in to stop the bleeding. And now he knows everything she said has been true. And then Ely sits on Oscar's lap for a very important chat. And unlike Hollywood movies, the damage she just suffered appeasing Oscar a few minutes ago hasn't magically vanished to keep her pretty looking. For a second time, she lets her guard down, and we see the real Ely at her most vulnerable. In defense of her killing people to survive, she recites the first words she ever heard Oscar speak in the yard when he fantasized about wanting to kill his bullies. He argues her point by pointing out he's never actually killed anybody, but she reminds him he really wants to. And after some thought, he realizes she's right. and this agreement bonds them by highlighting the fact they're not that different after all. This happens right as we're heading into the final act, and it's the last thing Oscar needed to realize if he was going to complete his story arc. So she takes a shower and Oscar gives her one of his mother's dresses, and while she's changing, he peeks in and sees something I'm not going to show you that alludes to the fact Ely's actually a 200-year-old castrated boy. The next day, while Ely's sleeping in the bathtub, Lackey comes around for a visit. He's drunk and very upset after losing his girlfriend and his friend at the start of the story. He thinks he knows who's responsible. He grabs a knife from the kitchen and starts opening doors while Oscar's hiding under the kitchen table. Eventually, Lackey finds Ely in her makeshift coffin bathtub, and as he's preparing to end her in her sleep, Oscar startles him from behind just long enough for Ely to do her thing. Oscar closes the door quietly behind him and leaves her to it. Once she's done, she thanks him. Realizing she'll be caught now, she tells him she has to go, and she kisses him goodbye. The next morning, Oscar cries. And it looks like crying, not somebody trying to secure a nomination for some fucking award. Then one of the bullies calls his house under false pretenses to make sure he shows up for his exercise class later that night. And one of them's brought their big brother along. He starts a dumpster fire, so the teacher's forced to leave the kids alone in the pool. When the bullies lock the doors, it kicks off one of the best endings to a horror movie that I have ever seen. The bully's older brother forces Oscar to hold his breath for 3 minutes at knife point. And as the clock ticks by, you feel every second of it. Right when you're feeling his lungs shriveling from a lack of oxygen, this happens.
That is how you fucking do it. That scene should embarrass everybody in Hollywood. This proves you do not need a boatload of money or big name actors or all the technology in the world to make a perfect horror scene. All you actually need is to love horror. And the sad truth is, Hollywood is mostly just a business now.
As the movie winds down, we're shown the opening snow shot again exactly as it appeared the first time, only this time Alfredson's using it to represent Oscar's transformation. Snow never stays, and people never stay the same. The final scene has Oscar leaving home to step into his new role as Ely's familiar, and he's tapping his finger on the trunk Ely's hiding in. And if you're not nerdy enough to look it up yourself, he's tapping the word kiss in Morse code.
And there you have it, folks. The plot to Let the Right One In. Let's dive straight into the good bits.
In a subgenre totally saturated with repetitive storylines and cliches, Let the Right One In stands out for a lot of reasons. The movie uses a cold, muted color palette, and that makes you feel isolated and bleak throughout the entire runtime. Doing this makes the Swedish winter almost a character in itself. And the cinematography perfectly complements this by capturing the mood and creating a sense of foreboding even in the quieter scenes. And unlike a lot of horror movies, Let the Right One In opts for understated storytelling. The horror elements aren't constantly thrown in your face with a violin blast. Instead, the tension in the atmosphere is built with suggestion and implication. Regarding character, the portrayal of Oscar's struggles with bullying and his inability to find camaraderie with his peers feels genuine and relatable. It's this authenticity that grounds the film, making the supernatural elements feel even more startling in contrast. Both young actors deliver outstanding performances that bring complex, well-written characters from the page to the screen. Their chemistry on screen is undeniable, and their performances play a huge role in making this story work. This film's also rich in symbolism and deeper themes. Beyond the obvious horror tropes, it delves into ideas about the nature of evil and the complexities of love, and the lengths one might go to avoid loneliness. The film also provides a glimpse into Swedish culture and society, which may be unfamiliar to many international viewers, and this cultural context adds another layer of depth to the film. Regarding the source material, while there are differences between the novel and the film, the essence of the story remains consistent. Fans of the book generally appreciate the choices Alfredson made when adapting the book for the movie.
And most importantly, in the good bits, in my opinion, is the relationship between Oscar and Ely.
It had to be portrayed perfectly for this film to work. Their interactions needed to be nuanced and poignant to provide depth to the characters, and that's because at its heart, Let the Right One In is a story about two outsiders finding balance and purpose with each other. On the surface, their bond's sweet and disturbing and complicated, but below the surface, this movie's really about finding peace within yourself. Oscar, the deceptively innocent, bullied young boy, comes to realize he's anything but innocent. If Ely never crossed his path, it was only a matter of time before he blossomed into a full-fledged serial killer. Alfredson takes time to show you Oscar's parents loved him and cared for him. To tell you Oscar's tendencies are his own. Ely even calls him out on it directly. Oscar was a ticking time bomb before she even met him, and that quality is precisely what Ely needs in her new familiar. She hates having to kill to survive, and this makes them a perfectly fucked up yin and yang going forward. This concept comes full circle when Ely realizes she doesn't need to push Oscar away to protect him. And Oscar realizes he can be his truest, extreme self with her and nobody else. All of these good points combined with this conclusion make Let the Right One In not just a brilliant low-budget Swedish vampire movie, but a standout film full stop.
But movies are art, and art is meant to be interpreted, so not every movie fan is going to see things the same way.
While this movie's pacing is a strong point for me, some viewers, especially those accustomed to fast-paced horror, felt the film might have dragged in parts. On a similar note, the movie's heavy reliance on subtle storytelling can leave some audiences wanting more overt horror. And as a Swedish film, some of the cultural references might not resonate with international audiences because some people just aren't interested in other people's cultures. The film also touches on complex aspects of Ely's nature and her past, without delving too deeply into them, and some viewers might have appreciated the clarity the book provided. Also, viewers expecting traditional vampire horror elements like graphic violence or jump scares might have been disappointed by the film's psychological and atmospheric approach. It deals with deep themes like loneliness and morality and the nature of evil, and that's just not everybody's cup of blood. Tea, I mean. And finally, the 2-inch tall hurdle so many modern moviegoers refuse to jump over. Obviously, non-Swedish speaking audiences have to rely on subtitles, which can be off-putting for some viewers. Personally, I've been watching foreign movies for so long I don't even see the subtitles anymore. But even I know a lot can get lost translating something as nuanced as horror into another language. Not to mention, Friday night movies often happen at the end of a long work week. Who the hell wants to read on a Friday night? So, should you watch Let the Right One In if you haven't seen it already? Or should you tackle the DVD while it's jogging through the park and string it up in a tree and drain all the movie out of it onto the snow?
If you're a fan of light-hearted, popular horror movies with lots of loud noises and villains that don't have a lot of depth to them, this movie might not be for you. But if you're into thinking while you're watching horror movies and thinking about the horror movie a long time after it's done playing, you can't miss this one. It's just a masterclass in horror movies and filmmaking in general. As always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, folks.